grew up in South Central Pennsylvania, kind of in Pennsylvania Dutch County, and my mother was an artist. She was basically self-taught. She took some workshops, but she started doing toll painting and Pennsylvania Dutch folk art. So at an early age, I was really exposed to her practice. She did it really for she was a really passionate artist, but she also was very pragmatic. So we were going to craft shows together. We go to like the Fordham University Craft Fair in New York City, holding down the tent during the hurricane, holding the metal poles as her daughters. Really fun. And I learned to paint, and I learned like color, which of course does me no good. Color theory at a very young age with my mom, and she had an amazing library. So this is one of probably the first still lifes that I was exposed to as a child. I used to go through her books, and at different times had various disdain and appreciation for the things I saw in her collection. But this is actually a theorem painting. It's a stencil on velvet that was done by an unknown artist in the 19th century, and it was an acceptable art form for women in the 19th century to beautify their homes. So they would bring in tutors to teach the young women how to stencil and apply color to make these objects to hang in their homes. So, also we collectively as a family are completely obsessed about food. And we're the kind of family that will be eating dinner and talking about what we're going to have for breakfast the next morning. So we do that. And then we plan our trips around food. So, it is a commitment. And we were only about 3 hours from New York City, so we would, and my mother actually grew up in Brooklyn, so we would go up to New York and we would go to get the bagels, and then we'd get ravioli, and then we'd go across town and eat at the Kiev, which is no longer there, and then we'd go for a bite, somewhere else before taking 3 dozen bagels back to Pennsylvania. This is actually in Rome. I did a semester abroad in Rome, and one of the things that I did was I went to a bakery and I would buy a cake, take it back to the studio, and I would simultaneously draw it and eat it at the same time until I didn't have, there was no more room to draw. My drawings became more involved kind of towards the end there. I moved up to New York after I finished at Tyler School of Art, Temple University, and I was living in Brooklyn, working in arts administration, and I was invited to do a piece for an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum in 2000, and this is actually Severin Rosen's Still Life with Fruit, which is ironic given the fact that your permanent collection piece is also next to a Severin Rosen here. So that's really the beginning of this entire Still Life series that I've been creating. You have such a nice Severin Rosen too, really. It was like, oh, I could use that painting for inspiration. Anyway, so obviously this is just a photocopy. This was my photocopy that I worked from. So I created a piece that was in response to Severin Rosen's painting. And the whole premise of that exhibition was kind of a call and response to artists. And I just intuitively created this object, just trying to find a way into the experience of what that painting was about. And also kind of inserting myself into centuries of dialogue about the still life genre. So that really led to a way of working, which I'm finally now at age 44 understanding that I'm pretty involved in working in a call and response way to site specific areas. And every time I do it, I panic. I think, oh my God, this is the time that I'm not going to be inspired. You know, if I get invited to go somewhere and sniff something out and try to create something, is this the time that I'm going to be blocked and I'm standing there with the director of X museum and I don't know what I'm going to do? But I found that it's really been a catalyst for creating in my work. So I'll get into that in a little bit, but when I do create compositions, I start with kind of a larger vocabulary of objects that I create in my studio, or sometimes I have people make things for me as well, and I'll start to work, and I always just have like a piece of paper down underneath my composition, and I'll just keep adding and subtracting to that composition. It's a three-dimensional drawing, essentially. When the composition is complete, I number everything, I draw lines around everything, I take it apart, and I move it to the next place it's going. So I was just telling a group of young docents here that I'm thinking about the end before I begin in terms of how can I move this composition around? How can I move it from place to place? What is the strategy to do that? So this is another layer of drawing that you don't get to see underneath the work. And this is called Venkecha. So for several years after making the piece at the Brooklyn Museum, I was taking specific paintings as inspiration and doing kind of a response directly to those individual paintings. At some point, that became a little formulaic. And I was given the opportunity to create an installation for the John Michael Kohler Arts Center, which is actually only 10 minutes from where I live now. And so, larger installation, and I had a short period of time to create the work, and virtually no money, of course, to do it. And so I contacted Wheaton Arts and Cultural Center in Millville, New Jersey, and I asked them if they would be willing to host me to come and create the components that I would need to create this work. They said yes, unbelievably. I'm totally indebted to them, but it was the first time I was so panicked about creating something in such a short period of time. It was so big. I was literally like warm bodies, like all of you could have been on the hot shop floor with me making things. I was like, you are a warm body, get over here. Start dipping in that furnace. And so that was a really key moment, actually, because it was driven by necessity, but I started to let go of the control of what the objects looked like. And the process of making the objects became it became a reflection of capturing a moment in time with those individuals making those objects. So I was working with gaffers that were, 30, 40 years experience working in glass, and literally people that had never touched hot glass before in their lives. And I had a series of Harlem style still life paintings that I had photocopied and given out copies to these different people, and I said, you can make anything that you see on this painting. If it doesn't turn out, I want you to put it in the kiln and anneal it so that it doesn't break. If it drops on the floor and breaks, I want you to pick it up and put it in the annealer. So I started creating a democratic way of looking at and using objects. So there's no real hierarchy in the work for me. Like the most beautifully executed goblet is only that beautiful and amazing because of the blob of glass that you'll find next to it. So this is a 20-foot long piece called Venkecha. I made this in '03. It's a detail, you never get to see this. Only you get to see this view. It's taken at the Renwick Gallery. So, I also work in photography. I've been working in photography since 2007. At one point, I was actually sitting with Jane Malash, another really amazing curator, and we were looking at my photographs, discussing an exhibition, and it kind of both came to us simultaneously that the photographs themselves had a lot of merit. And from that point on, I started creating the glass for compositions taking the photograph and then destroying the glass or recycling the glass. And each photograph is scaled to one of the objects in the composition, whether it's in the background or the foreground. This piece in particular, so some of them you'll see upstairs, some of them are printed directly on acrylic or plexiglass. And there's another piece like this. So you're getting a shadow, then they're framed so that you get almost like a three-dimensional shadowy thing that happens when the light hits the image and bounces back through. I really like this work because it opened a new way of thinking about still life and understanding of a depiction of objects in terms of what we desire, what we covet, what represents us, very classic material culture issues, and yet it removes the material completely. At the time, when I started doing these, I was showing at a media-specific gallery in New York, a glass-specific gallery, and I kept hearing over and over, there's no glass, what are you getting? I was like, that's right, there's no glass. It's exactly my point. So it was good. It's a good practice. I really enjoy working in this way. These are also printed on plexi, and the objects themselves are an absence of pigment. So you're looking through the objects, through the void. This one is upstairs. It's a little teaser. More on photography later. This is more on call and response. I've occasionally through the years been asked to come into different institutions and respond to some part of their collection. And since the majority of my inspiration in this world, besides my family, is they are in permanent collections of museums, it was kind of a natural thing for me. I mean, I could spend hours and hours studying collections. I especially like specific collections of one individual, like the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. I actually worked there. It was very influential. Or the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I'm really very keen on specific collections. Anyway, this is the Pendleton House of the RISD Museum. And in 2008, I created After You're Gone. So this installation referred to parts of their permanent collection. They also have an amazing wallpaper collection, probably one of the best in this country, of 18th century wallpaper. So the wallpaper on the walls, the black and clear, is a replica of some of their wallpaper, and the love seat in the corner, you're gonna have to listen to me a little bit longer about this particular piece, but I was drawn to this piece. I didn't understand necessarily why, and I knew I wanted to find a way to replicate it in my work, although it's not really a replication, right? It's more of an homage to or some expression of that object. That love seat is one replication of one chair that Pendleton owned that was attributed to Grinling Gibbons, who was a 17th century carver. And he loved the chair so much that he had it replicated 14 times, and then had 2 love seats made, 2 Siamese chairs put together. And then after he passed away, it was determined it was not even a Grinling Gibbons chair. So that's like just sums it up right there. That's all I need. Unbeknownst to me, I was also pregnant while I was working on this chair with identical twins. So careful what you make. So more details. This is about one another's, which you can see upstairs. I was invited by the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach to come down and respond to their collection. I had not been there before. I had no idea what I was going to do, and immediately next to the museum is a graveyard. So So that was, I started thinking about museum, mausoleum, you know, kind of semantics before I walked into the museum. And what I proposed to do was this piece. It's actually, the objects are sitting on a casket that is scaled to my size. The piece is coated with pineapple plant parts, which refer to a settler, which I found out later was buried in the basement of the museum, because the museum itself was also built on a settler's graveyard, which I was not allowed to talk about for years. The director was like, "Don't tell anyone." I was like, "But that's the whole point. I have to talk about it." So there's, you know, I kind of had this psychic link because this piece was installed on the top floor in a still life exhibition. And I also included aspects of the paintings that you saw prior, like the sash around the goat and some of the objects. There's monkeys with balls and chain in the painting beneath, but I used ball and chain with birds. So I just combined, I think of it as a composite portrait of the museum itself, the early settlers that the museum is built over, and myself. So there's that. Also invited by the Jewish Museum in New York to create a piece based on their collection. And initially they had me looking at paintings there. And I'm basically like a non-practicing Jew. I mean, I practice through food. So there's that. But they kept saying, "Oh, you should, you know, there's some relationship, you should," you know, the curator's no longer there that was saying this, but he was like, it should be personal. I was like, I don't do that really. But you know, everything is personal. Everything's personal. And ultimately, my exploration in that work was understanding that I really had almost no relationship to a lot of the objects in their collection, even though that was the religion that I was raised in. So it was a combination of symbols of each holiday within the Jewish year, and also it did become personal. I put my dad's talent on the table, and I represented my mother in a different way, and then the whole table is kind of coated with glass rocks, which in the Jewish tradition you place a stone, as some of you know, on the gravestone, the gravestone or the head or footstone instead of flowers, and there's a ham hock. I live in Wisconsin. I have to put ham on there. So. Another call and response piece. This is at the Chrysler Museum of Art. They have a satellite house museum, the Moses Myers House in Norfolk, Virginia. Went there, spent a day learning about all of the ghosts that haunt the Moses Myers house and the Moses Myers' family, and it was fascinating. And the day that I went there, they were upgrading the security and changing the HVAC system, so all of the permanent collection of this house was consolidated into the rooms like this. And I would go up to something like that, you know, the green terrain. I was like, I love this. And Alex, the curator, was like, well, that wasn't really part of the Myers' house. You know, community members just thought it would look good here, and they brought it over and did. And so then, you know, that sparked all of these questions about authenticity and belief systems. You know, and I still really. I kind of dip heavily into ideas of belief, whether it's science or religion or around objects or family. Belief systems are pretty interesting. Also, Moses Myers copied meticulously every single letter, just like Jefferson, that he ever wrote to anyone. So they have one of the most complete collections of correspondence, and it's one of the most, if not the most, complete Federalist collection of objects in the country. It's pretty amazing. So a couple of years ago, this was in 2013, I did a residency there. So this doorway up here on the left is, so the house, that doorway, when it's closed, looks like a cabinet of some kind or a book nook or something, and you open it, see if we can go back for a second, and you open it and it's the fence, and then there's like a 3-foot drop in this weird hallway, because sometime in the 60s, a carpenter decided that he was going to restore the house to its former glory, and he thought that was original. Once again, another belief system. So it created this very strange, walkway that no one could use in the house, that was unavailable. It was literally the closet that you would stumble on.